The sound of a single gunshot echoed through the vast Wyoming plains, shattering the peaceful morning silence just as violently as it had shattered Nora Ziegler's life 1 year ago to the day. She pulled the trigger again, watching the empty whiskey bottle explode into jagged fragments against the fence post. Satisfaction never came, not even when the glass scattered like the remnants of her once happy life. "Reckon that bottle never did you no harm, madam," a deep voice drawled from behind her. Nora spun around, pistol still raised, to find a tall stranger atop a chestnut stallion. The rising sun silhouetted his broad shoulders and the distinctive shape of his Stetson. She didn't lower her weapon. "My land, my bottles, my business," she replied coldly, her fingers still hovering near the trigger. "State your purpose, or ride on." It was 1878, and the West hadn't been entirely tamed, especially not here in the shadow of the Medicine Bow Mountains. 3 years of running her husband's ranch alone had taught Nora to greet strangers with caution and a loaded gun. The man dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent his life in the saddle. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 to her 26 years, with eyes the color of prairie grass after rain and a jawline that could have been carved from the surrounding mountains. "Name's Vaughn Hayes," he said, keeping his hands visible and making no move toward the holstered revolver at his hip. "Passing through to Laramie. Your foreman fella named Tanner offered me a day's work mending your north fence line. Said it would earn me a hot meal and a place in the bunkhouse." Nora lowered her gun slightly but didn't holster it. "Tanner doesn't make those decisions." "No, madam. I expect you do," Vaughn replied. "But your cattle are finding that gap, and I've got 2 good hands willing to work." A gust of wind whipped across the plains, tugging at Nora's dark blonde hair that had escaped her braid. She studied the stranger, noting the worn but well-kept clothes, the calloused hands, and most importantly, the honest look in his eyes. Men with secrets didn't maintain eye contact like that. "One day's work," she finally conceded, holstering her weapon. "You fix the fence, you get your meal and a night's lodging. Come sunrise, you ride on." Vaughn Hayes tipped his hat. "Yes, madam. Much obliged." As he led his horse toward the barn, Nora couldn't help but notice the way he walked like a man who knew his path, but carried a weight on his shoulders. She recognized that burden all too well. Nora returned to the ranch house, a modest 2-story structure her husband James had built with his own hands when they'd first claimed this land. The morning's shooting ritual had left her with the familiar hollow feeling that no amount of destroyed bottles could fill. She busied herself with chores, trying to push away the memories that always surfaced on this anniversary. From the kitchen window, she watched as Vaughn worked alongside Tanner at the north pasture. Even from a distance, she could see his efficiency, the way he measured twice before cutting, how he tested each post to ensure it would hold. By midday, he'd accomplished more than most hired hands did in a full day. "Miss Nora," Tanner called from the porch as the sun began its westward descent. "That fence is solid as the mountains now. Hayes knows his business." She nodded, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. "He can wash up at the pump. Supper's in an hour." The ranch hands ate in the bunkhouse, but Nora had always maintained the tradition of feeding temporary workers at her table, a practice James had started. It was one of the few connections to him she couldn't bring herself to break. Vaughn appeared at the appointed hour, hair damp from washing, hat in hand. The trail dust had been scrubbed away, revealing a face younger than she'd first thought. Handsome, if she were inclined to notice such things anymore. "Madam," he greeted, standing awkwardly at the door. "It's just Nora," she corrected, gesturing to the table where a simple meal of stew, biscuits, and coffee awaited. "I don't stand on ceremony here." They ate in silence for several minutes before Vaughn spoke. "Fine land you have. Those Herefords in the south pasture are prime stock." "My husband had an eye for good cattle," she replied automatically. Had? The question hung in the air between them. He's been gone a year today, Nora said, surprising herself with the admission. Rustlers. He rode out one morning and never came back. Found him and two of our hands the next day. Vaughn set down his spoon. I'm sorry for your loss. The simple words, devoid of the usual platitudes, somehow felt more genuine than all the condolences she'd received. 3 good men dead for 8 head of cattle, she continued, the bitterness rising in her voice. The sheriff tracked the rustlers to the territorial line but lost them. Said there wasn't enough evidence to pursue further. And you've been running this spread alone since then? Vaughn asked. With Tanner and the boys. We manage. She stood abruptly, clearing plates that weren't empty. There's coffee still, if you want it. Bunkhouse is open. Tanner will show you. She needed him to leave this stranger with the perceptive eyes who somehow made her say more than she'd intended. But Vaughn remained seated. Those green eyes studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Miss Nora, he said slowly, I didn't just happen by your ranch today. Her hand moved instinctively toward the drawer where she kept a small derringer. I've been tracking a gang of rustlers across 3 territories, he continued, led by a man named Silas Blackwood. They hit your ranch a year ago. Nora felt the blood drain from her face. How do you know that name? Because 6 months before they killed your husband, they killed my brother. Vaughn's voice was steady, but his knuckles whitened as he gripped his coffee cup. I was a deputy marshal out of Colorado Territory, been on their trail ever since. You're the law? Nora asked, skepticism evident in her tone. Was, he corrected. Badge didn't help me cross territorial lines, turned it in so I could follow them properly. The revelation should have comforted her, but instead, it ignited a spark of anger. So you lied to get onto my ranch. I needed to see if the rumors were true that the widow Ziegler was still holding on, despite everything. He met her gaze without flinching. Some said you'd sold out months ago. And why would that matter to you, Mr. Hayes? Because Blackwood's gang is circling back through this territory. Word is they're planning something big, and your ranch sits right in their path. Nora felt a chill despite the warm kitchen. You think they're coming back here? Why would they bother with us again? Because you're vulnerable, and your land connects 3 major cattle trails, Vaughn explained. Perfect place for them to set up and hit bigger outfits moving herds north. So you came to warn me? You could have done that without the pretense of needing work. Vaughn set his coffee cup down carefully. No, madam. I came because I think you and I want the same thing, justice for the people we lost, and I believe we stand a better chance working together than apart. The proposition hung in the air between them. Nora turned away, staring out the window at the darkening landscape, the land she and James had sacrificed everything for. I've been shooting at bottles for a year, Mr. Hayes, she finally said. It hasn't brought James back, or given me any peace. No, madam, I expect it hasn't. He stood, placing his hat back on his head. But stopping Blackwood might keep other women from becoming widows. And that's something worth fighting for. I reckon. As he headed for the door, Nora made a decision she hoped she wouldn't regret. Sunrise is at 5, she called after him. I'll expect you for breakfast if you're staying to help. Vaughn paused, turning back with the ghost of a smile. Yes, madam, I'll be here. After he left, Nora sat alone at the table for a long time, wondering what she'd just agreed to. Outside, a coyote howled at the rising moon, a lonesome sound that echoed the emptiness inside her. For the first time in a year, however, that emptiness was tinged with something else, a flicker of purpose that wasn't there before. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the first hint of autumn coloring the distant mountains. Nora had been up since before first light, her sleep disturbed by dreams of James and faceless men on horseback. She was already on her second cup of coffee when a knock sounded at the door. Vaughn stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking as though he'd been up for hours himself. "Morning," he greeted simply. Nora nodded and stepped aside to let him enter. Breakfast was a simple affair of eggs, bacon, and biscuits left from the previous night. They ate mostly in silence, but it was less strained than their dinner had been. "I need to know your plan," Nora said finally, pushing her half-eaten breakfast away. "If Blackwood really is coming back through this territory, what exactly do you intend to do about it?" Vaughn finished his coffee before answering. "First, we need to make your ranch less inviting. Blackwood preys on what he perceives as weakness. Second, I need to send word to a few trusted friends men I've worked with before who have their own reasons to want Blackwood brought to justice. And third," Nora pressed. "Third, we set a trap." His eyes met hers. "But that part depends on how much risk you're willing to take." Nora considered his words. "This is my home, Mr. Hayes. I've already lost everything else that mattered. I won't be driven off by fear." Vaughn nodded, seeming to have expected this answer. "Then we'll need to start by shoring up your defenses. How many hands do you have working now?" "4, including Tanner, down from the 10 we had when James was alive." "Not enough," Vaughn muttered. "But we'll make do. Can you ride? Really ride, not just for Sunday outings?" Nora's eyes flashed. "I was breaking horses while the other girls in town were learning to pour tea, Mr. Hayes. I can outride most men in the county." For the first time, a genuine smile crossed Vaughn's face. "Good. That'll make this easier." He stood. "I'd like to ride your property line today, get a feel for the terrain. Would you be willing to show me?" An hour later, they were mounted and heading toward the eastern boundary of the ranch. Nora rode a spirited bay mare, sitting the saddle with the natural grace of someone born to it. Vaughn, on his chestnut stallion, watched her with growing respect. "Your husband?" he ventured as they rode side by side across a wide meadow. "How did you meet him?" Nora stiffened slightly but answered. "My father owned the general store in Laramie. James came in for supplies when he first arrived from back east. He kept finding reasons to return." A small smile played at her lips despite herself. "Mother was scandalized when he asked to court me. Said no good would come of a refined girl like me taking up with a man bent on taming the wilderness." "But you didn't listen." "I was 18 and headstrong. James was 23 and had dreams bigger than the Wyoming sky." Her voice softened with the memory. "We were married 2 months later and headed straight for this valley. There was nothing here then, just open land and promise." "You built something fine," Vaughn observed, gesturing to the well-maintained fences and healthy herds visible in the distance. "We did," Nora agreed. 7 years of backbreaking work. And then—" She trailed off, her expression hardening. 1 year of holding on by my fingernails." They crested a rise that offered a view of the eastern range, where the land belonging to the Z-Bar Ranch, as James had named it, after Nora, met the public domain. "This is where they came through," Nora said, pointing to a narrow draw between 2 hills. "James always said it was our weak point. He'd planned to build a line shack here, keep a man posted during calving season." Vaughn dismounted, studying the ground and the surrounding terrain with the practiced eye of a tracker. "Good ambush point," he commented. "They could have watched your operation for days from those hills without being spotted." "That's a comforting thought," Nora replied dryly, remaining in the saddle. "Knowledge is power, Miss Nora." Vaughn remounted. "Knowing how they think gives us an advantage." They continued their circuit of the property throughout the day, stopping occasionally to rest the horses or discuss particularly vulnerable areas. By the time they returned to the ranch house, the sun was low in the sky, painting the landscape in golds and reds. "I'll have Tanner assign 2 men to night patrol," Nora said as they unsaddled their mounts. "We've been lax about that since winter." Vaughn nodded approvingly. "Good start. Tomorrow, I'd like to check your armory, See what weapons we have available. You really believe they're coming back, don't you? Nora asked, pausing in her task. I've been tracking Blackwood's patterns for nearly 2 years, Vaughn replied grimly. He's methodical. Returns to areas he knows are profitable. And your ranch? He hesitated. Say it, Nora prompted. Your ranch is known to be run by a widow with a reduced crew. In Blackwood's eyes, that makes you a target. The blunt assessment stung, but Nora appreciated his honesty. Then we'll just have to show him how wrong he is, she said with determination. That evening, after dining with the ranch hands in the bunkhouse, a departure from her usual solitude that raised a few eyebrows, Nora and Vaughn sat on the porch, mapping out plans for reinforcing the ranch's defenses. I can send for 2 men I trust, Vaughn explained, Caleb Porter and Daniel Reed, both former lawmen who've had run-ins with Blackwood's gang. They can be here within a week if the telegraph lines are working. And you're certain they'll come? Nora questioned. Seems a lot to ask for a personal vendetta. It's not just personal anymore, Vaughn said quietly. Blackwood's gang has killed 15 men across 4 territories that we know of. This isn't about revenge, it's about justice. Nora studied him in the fading light. Is it? Be honest with me, Mr. Hayes. If it was just about justice, you'd have stayed with the law. Vaughn was silent for a long moment. My brother Noah was 24 when they killed him, he finally said. He'd been married just 6 months. His wife was carrying their first child. His voice remained steady, but Nora could hear the pain beneath it. So no, it's not just about justice, but that doesn't make it wrong. The vulnerability in his admission touched something in Nora, a recognition of shared grief that transcended the wariness she felt toward this man who had appeared so suddenly in her life. Your brother's child, she asked softly. What happened? A boy, Vaughn replied, a hint of warmth entering his voice. They named him Nathan. He lives with his mother in Denver now. I send what money I can. The simple statement revealed more about Vaughn Hayes than perhaps he intended. A man who hunted killers across the wilderness but still made sure to provide for his brother's widow and child was a man of principle. Send your telegraph, Nora decided. I'll ride into town with you tomorrow. We'll need supplies anyway if we're adding to the crew. The trip to Laramie the next day proved more eventful than either had anticipated. The small but growing town was bustling with activity cattle buyers from the east, mingling with cowboys, settlers, and the usual assortment of characters that populated frontier communities. While Vaughn sent his telegrams, Nora visited her father's store, now run by her younger brother Patrick. Their reunion was warm but brief, as Nora was reluctant to share the true reason for her visit to town. You should come home, Nora, Patrick urged as he filled her order for supplies. The ranch is draining you. I see it in your face every time you come to town. The ranch is my home, she replied firmly. Has been for 8 years now. James would understand if you sold it, Patrick pressed. He wouldn't want you working yourself to death out there alone. I'm not alone. I have good hands. Nora began gathering the packaged supplies. And I'm not selling. Not now. Not ever. Patrick sighed, clearly having expected this response. At least tell me who that man is you rode in with. Folks are already talking. Nora stiffened. Mr. Hayes is helping with some repairs on the ranch. That's all there is to it. Before Patrick could respond, the store's door swung open and 3 men entered. Nora immediately tensed. She recognized the leader, a lean, hawk-faced man named Ethan Carver, who had once worked briefly for the Z-Bar Ranch before James dismissed him for stealing. Well, well, Carver drawled, his gaze fixing on Nora. If it ain't the widowed Mrs. Ziegler, come to grace us common folk with her presence. Patrick moved protectively toward his sister. State your business or move along, Carver. We don't want trouble here. Carver ignored him, his focus remaining on Nora. Heard you've got a new man staying at the ranch, he said, his tone insinuating. Folks are wondering if you've found yourself a replacement for poor James already. Nora felt heat rise to her face, but she kept her voice level. My business is my own, Carver. Now step aside. I have things to do. Carver didn't budge. Thing is, Mrs. Ziegler, some of us have been wondering how a lone woman manages to keep that big spread running. Makes a man curious about where the money comes from. The implication was clear and deliberately insulting. Patrick's face reddened with anger, but, before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. I believe the lady asked you to step aside. Vaughn stood in the doorway, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard as flint. He made no move toward his gun. But there was something in his stance that made Carver and his companions suddenly wary. This ain't your concern, stranger, Carver said, though with noticeably less swagger. I'm making it my concern, Vaughn replied evenly. Now, you can walk out that door on your own 2 feet, or we can see how well you crawl. Your choice. For a tense moment, Nora thought Carver might actually draw his weapon. Instead, after a calculating look at Vaughn, he backed toward the door, motioning for his companions to follow. This ain't over, he muttered as he passed. Better watch your back, widow woman. Once they were gone, Nora released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you, she said to Vaughn, though I could have handled Carver. I don't doubt it, Vaughn replied, the tension leaving his shoulders. But there's something you should know about him. He glanced at Patrick, then back to Nora. Could we speak privately? Patrick, understanding, moved to help another customer who had entered the store, giving them space. Ethan Carver has been seen riding with a man matching Silas Blackwood's description, Vaughn said in a low voice. I can't confirm it yet, but if I'm right, he's either scouting for them or has joined their gang outright. Nora felt a chill run through her. Are you certain? Carver's a bully and a thief, but a murderer? Men like Blackwood have a way of finding those with weak character and exploiting it, Vaughn explained. Carver knows your ranch, knows your routine. That makes him valuable. The implications were disturbing. If Carver was indeed working with Blackwood, the threat to the Z-Bar Ranch was even more immediate than Vaughn had initially believed. We should head back, Nora decided. I want to warn Tanner about this development. They made their preparations to leave town quickly after that. As they rode back toward the ranch, Nora found herself watching the landscape with new eyes, seeing potential threats in every shadowed draw and stand of trees. We can't live in fear, Vaughn said, seeming to read her thoughts. That's what men like Blackwood count on. I'm not afraid, Nora responded automatically, then paused. No, that's not true. I am afraid. But not for myself. She gestured to the open country around them. I'm afraid for this land, for what James and I built. I'm afraid of failing him. Vaughn was quiet for a moment before responding. From what I've seen, you've done him proud, Miss Nora. Keeping a ranch going alone for a year in this country? Many men couldn't have managed it. His words, simple and direct, warmed something inside her that had been cold for a very long time. They rode in companionable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the ranch, however, Vaughn suddenly reined in his horse, holding up a hand for Nora to do the same. What is it? She asked, immediately alert. Smoke, he said tersely, pointing to a thin gray column rising from the direction of the ranch. Too much for a cooking fire. Without another word, they spurred their horses forward, racing across the open plain toward the Z-Bar. As they crested the final rise, Nora's heart nearly stopped. The bunkhouse was ablaze, flames licking hungrily at the wooden structure. Ranch hands were forming a bucket brigade from the well, but it was clear they were fighting a losing battle. Tanner spotted them and ran over as they dismounted. Riders hit us about an hour ago, he reported grimly, his face streaked with soot. 4 men came in shooting. We drove them off. but not before they torched the bunkhouse. Casualties? Vaughn asked sharply. Miguel took a bullet in the shoulder. Doc's with him now in the main house. No one else hurt bad, just cuts and bruises. Nora was already striding toward her home, fear and fury warring within her. Did you recognize any of them? She called over her shoulder. One for sure, Tanner replied, jogging to keep up. That snake Ethan Carver. Recognized his paint horse. Vaughn and Nora exchanged grim looks. This was no coincidence. They're testing our defenses, Vaughn said quietly. Seeing how we respond. Then let's show them we're not as vulnerable as they think, Nora replied, her voice hard with determination. For the next several days, the ranch operated in a state of heightened vigilance. The surviving hands moved into the main house and barn, keeping watch in shifts. Vaughn took charge of security arrangements with a quiet competence that the men respected, while Nora managed the day-to-day operations of the ranch. Working side by side, they developed a rhythm Nora's practical knowledge of the ranch complementing Vaughn's tactical experience. Despite the circumstances, Nora found herself appreciating his presence more each day. He treated her neither as a helpless widow nor as a curiosity, but as a capable partner in their shared mission. On the fourth day after the attack, Vaughn's friends arrived: Caleb Porter, a taciturn former Texas Ranger with iron gray hair and a reputation as one of the best trackers in the West, and Daniel Reed, younger and more affable, but with the steady hands and watchful eyes of a seasoned lawman. Appreciate you coming, Vaughn greeted them after introductions had been made. Wouldn't miss it, Reed replied with a grim smile. Blackwood's got a lot to answer for. Porter simply nodded, his weathered face revealing little emotion. Where do you want us, Hayes? That evening, the four of them gathered in Nora's kitchen to formulate a plan. Porter spread a rough map of the surrounding territory on the table, marking key positions and likely approaches. Blackwood's not known for subtlety, he explained in his gravelly voice. He hits hard and fast, usually at dawn when folks are just waking up. But he's also not a fool, Reed added. He'll have scouts watching the ranch, reporting on our movements. Like Carver, Nora supplied. Exactly, Vaughn agreed. Which is why we need to be careful about what we let them see. The plan they developed was risky, but had the advantage of playing to their strengths. They would make it appear that Vaughn and the two newcomers were leaving, supposedly discouraged by the recent attack. This would give Blackwood confidence to strike again. In reality, they would double back and position themselves to ambush the gang when they made their move. It's your ranch at risk, Miss Ziegler, Porter said bluntly. Are you certain you want to stake everything on this play? Nora looked around the kitchen, the heart of the home she had built with James. On the wall hung his old rifle, and beside it, a photograph of them on their wedding day. Her gaze returned to the three men at her table, each with their own reasons for standing against Silas Blackwood. I'm certain, she said firmly. This ends now. The next morning they put their plan into motion. Vaughn, Porter, and Reed made a show of packing their gear and riding out, heading north toward Cheyenne. They took the main road, ensuring they would be visible to any watching eyes. Nora, meanwhile, went about her business as usual, though with the quiet tension of someone awaiting an inevitable confrontation. Tanner and the remaining hands had been briefed on the plan and knew their roles. As dusk approached, Vaughn and his companions circled back, using a little-known trail through the hills to return undetected to the ranch. They positioned themselves in the barn, the root cellar of the main house, and a small equipment shed, all with clear views of the main approach to the ranch. Nora kept a shotgun close at hand as she moved about the house, lighting lamps and preparing for a night that might bring either resolution or disaster. As darkness fell completely, she found herself standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the moonlit yard. A soft knock at the back door startled her. She raised her shotgun, approaching cautiously. It's me. Vaughn's voice came through the door. She opened it quickly, relief washing over her. Everything in place? He nodded, stepping inside. Porters spotted movement in the eastern hills. Could be nothing, but... He left the implication hanging. But it could be them, Nora finished. How soon? If they follow the pattern, dawn. Vaughn studied her face in the lamplight. You should try to get some rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Nora shook her head. I couldn't sleep if I tried. Vaughn seemed to understand. He moved to the stove where coffee still simmered. Mind if I join you in that case? They sat at the kitchen table, the same places they had occupied for meals over the past days. The silence between them was comfortable now. No longer the wary quiet of strangers. Tell me about your brother, Nora said suddenly. The person he was. Not just how he died. Vaughn looked surprised by the request, but after a moment, a genuine smile touched his lips. Noah was the best of us. Quick to laugh, slow to anger. Had a way with horses they'd follow him like he was speaking their language. He took a sip of coffee. He wasn't built for violence. That's what makes it so damn unfair. James was the same, Nora replied softly. He had dreams of turning this place into a horse breeding operation eventually. Said cattle were just to pay the bills until we could focus on what he really loved. Sounds like a man with vision. He was. Nora traced the rim of her cup with a finger. After he died, I thought about selling. Nearly did, in fact. Had an offer from a cattle company out of Chicago. What stopped you? Nora looked up, meeting his gaze. Spite, at first. I didn't want James's killers to win. Then habit, the daily work of running this place, kept me from drowning in grief. She paused. And finally, love. I realized I loved this land almost as much as I'd loved him. Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. And after? When Blackwood's been dealt with? What then? It was a question Nora hadn't allowed herself to consider. The future had been an abstract concept, something that existed beyond the immediate demands of survival. I don't know, she admitted. Keep going, I suppose. One day at a time. Vaughn seemed about to say more when a low whistle came from outside the signal they had arranged with Porter. In an instant, both were on alert, all introspection forgotten. I'll check it, Vaughn said, moving silently to the door. He returned moments later, his expression grim. Riders approaching from the east. Porter counted at least 8. Nora felt her heart race but was surprised to find fear replaced by a cold clarity. Earlier than expected. They're adapting, Vaughn agreed. Get to your position. Remember, wait for my signal. Nora nodded, checking her shotgun one last time before moving to the front of the house where she had a clear view of the approach. Vaughn disappeared into the darkness, heading for his own position in the barn loft. The minutes stretched endlessly as Nora waited, every sense heightened. She could hear the normal night sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the soft nickering of horses in the corral, the whisper of wind through the eaves. Then, gradually, those sounds gave way to the muffled approach of hoofbeats. They came without warning or demands, 8 riders emerging from the pre-dawn darkness, guns already drawn. In the lead was a man Nora had never seen but instantly recognized from Vaughn's descriptions, Silas Blackwood himself, a tall figure on a black horse, his face partially hidden by a wide-brimmed hat. Beside him rode Ethan Carver, a twisted smile visible even in the dim light. The rest were hard-faced men with the look of experienced killers. They approached the house directly, clearly expecting to find it and the surrounding buildings asleep and vulnerable. Instead, they rode into a carefully prepared trap. The signal came 3 sharp whistles cutting through the darkness. Immediately, gunfire erupted from multiple positions around the ranch yard. Porter and Reed had positioned themselves to target the rear of the group, while Vaughn's shots came from the barn loft, focusing on the leaders. Nora herself fired the shotgun from the house window, the blast catching one rider square in the chest and sending him tumbling from his saddle. The surprise was complete. Blackwood's men had ridden confidently into an ambush with no cover. 3 went down in the first volley. The remaining 5, including Blackwood and Carver, scattered, seeking shelter behind the water trough, a wagon, and the corner of the corral. Blackwood! Vaughn's voice rang out in the chaos. It's over. Throw down your weapons. A mocking laugh answered him, followed by a volley of bullets toward the barn loft. Hayes! Should have known you'd be here, Blackwood called back. Still chasing ghosts, I see. The only ghost here's gonna be you, Reed shouted from his position behind the tool shed, punctuating his words with 2 well-aimed shots that sent one of Blackwood's men diving for better cover. The firefight intensified, bullets splintering wood and shattering windows. Nora kept her position, watching for movement, firing when she had a clear shot. She could see Tanner and the other hands emerging from their positions around the property, tightening the circle around the remaining outlaws. Suddenly, movement to her left caught her attention. Carver had broken from his cover and was running directly toward the house, firing wildly as he came. Nora swung her shotgun toward him, but before she could fire, a bullet shattered the window frame beside her, showering her with splinters and forcing her to duck. When she looked up, Carver was at the porch, out of her line of fire. She heard the front door crash open, followed by heavy footsteps in the hallway. Come out, widow woman, Carver called, his voice thick with malice. Time to settle accounts. Nora moved quickly to the kitchen, positioning herself behind the solid oak table that she and James had built together. She had just tipped it on its side for cover when Carver burst through the doorway. There you are, he sneered, raising his revolver. Blackwood's paying extra for you, seeing as how you've caused so much trouble. James always said you were a coward, Carver, Nora replied steadily, raising her own weapon, hiding behind better men. Rage twisted Carver's features. Your husband was a fool who died begging for his life. The lie stoked a fire in Nora's belly. You're the liar and the fool, she said, her voice deadly calm. And then she pulled the trigger. The shotgun's blast in the confined space was deafening. Carver was thrown backward by the impact, crashing into the doorframe and then slumping to the floor, a look of surprise frozen on his face. Nora didn't have time to process what had just happened. Outside, the gunfight was reaching its climax. She moved carefully to the window, keeping low. In the yard, she could see that only Blackwood and one other man remained, pinned down behind an overturned wagon. It's finished, Blackwood, Vaughn called out. You're surrounded with nowhere to go. For answer, Blackwood made a desperate break for the corral where the horses were kept. He almost made it would have, if not for a perfect shot from Porter that caught him in the leg, sending him sprawling in the dirt. The remaining outlaw, seeing his leader fall, threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. As the echo of the last shot faded, an eerie quiet settled over the ranch yard. Nora stepped cautiously onto the porch, shotgun still ready. She saw Vaughn emerge from the barn, covering Blackwood with his revolver, as Porter secured the wounded man's hands behind his back. Reed approached the surrendering outlaw, disarming him completely before binding his wrists. Tanner and the other hands were checking the bodies of those who had fallen, ensuring the threat was truly neutralized. Carver? Vaughn called to Nora as she descended the porch steps. Dead, she replied simply, her voice steadier than she felt. Vaughn nodded, his gaze assessing her for injury. Finding none, he turned his attention back to Blackwood, who sat propped against the wagon wheel, blood seeping from his wounded leg. You've been hunting me a long time, Hayes, Blackwood said, his voice strained but still carrying that mocking edge. Was it worth it? Did it bring your brother back? No, Vaughn replied evenly, but it'll stop you from taking anyone else's brother or husband or father. He glanced at Nora. Justice isn't about what's lost. It's about what's saved. As the sun finally crested the eastern hills, bathing the ranch in golden light, Nora felt something shift within her, not healing, exactly, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that healing might one day be possible. The aftermath of the gunfight brought a flurry of activity to the Z-Bar Ranch. The sheriff from Laramie arrived by midday, accompanied by a deputy and the town doctor. Statements were taken, wounds were treated, and the bodies of the fallen outlaws were loaded onto a wagon for transport back to town. Blackwood and his surviving companion were placed under heavy guard for the journey to Laramie, where they would await trial for multiple counts of murder, rustling, and assorted other crimes across 3 territories. "You'll need to come to town to testify," the sheriff told Nora as they prepared to leave. "Both of you," he added, nodding to Vaughn. "We'll be there," Nora assured him, standing on the porch as the procession departed. When the dust from their wagon had settled, an odd quiet descended on the ranch. Porter and Reed had gone with the sheriff, intending to ensure Blackwood made it to jail and stayed there. The ranch hands were seeing to the necessary repairs and the day's chores, leaving Nora and Vaughn alone for the first time since the confrontation. "Your kitchen table saved your life," Vaughn commented, gesturing to the solid piece of furniture that now bore a significant gouge from Carver's bullet. "James always did believe in building things to last," Nora replied, running her fingers along the damaged wood. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the shared intensity of the past days suddenly giving way to uncertainty. "I should see to my horse," Vaughn finally said. "Make sure he wasn't spooked by all the gunfire." Nora nodded, watching him go with a strange hollowness growing inside her. The immediate danger was past. Justice had been served. And now? What? Would he simply ride away? His mission complete? The thought bothered her more than she cared to admit. That evening, after a quiet meal with the ranch hands, a celebration of sorts, though subdued by the violence they had all witnessed, Nora found herself once again on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. Vaughn joined her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one to her silently, then leaned against the railing beside her. "Beautiful country," he observed after a while. "It is," she agreed. "Worth fighting for. Worth living for, too," Vaughn added softly. Nora turned to study his profile in the fading light. "What happens now, Mr. Hayes? Now that you've caught the man you've been chasing for so long?" Vaughn was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "I've been asking myself the same question," he admitted. "For 2 years, finding Blackwood has been my only purpose. Now," he shrugged, "I suppose I could go back to law work, or maybe try ranching again. My family had a small spread in Colorado before Noah and I took different paths." "You were a rancher?" Nora asked, surprised. "For a time," he replied with a small smile. "Not as successful as you, though." The compliment warmed her, but she pressed on. "So you'll be moving on then?" Vaughn turned to face her fully. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether there's a reason to stay." The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Nora felt her heart quicken, an unfamiliar sensation after so many months of numbness. "I can't offer much," she said carefully. "The ranch needs work. I'm still healing." She looked down at her hands, surprised to find them trembling slightly. "James was my whole world for 8 years. I'm not asking to replace him," Vaughn said gently. "No one could, or should." "Then what are you asking?" Vaughn set his coffee cup on the railing and took a step closer to her. "When I first came here, I saw a woman whose heart was as shattered as my own. Someone who understood what it means to lose the future you thought you'd have." His voice was low, intimate. "I didn't expect to find someone who made me think about building a new future." Nora felt tears prick at her eyes, not the bitter tears of grief she had become accustomed to, but something different, something that felt dangerously like hope. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. My heart hasn't worked right since James died. It's like a clock that stopped ticking. Vaughn reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and took her hand in his. Then let mine beat for us both, he said simply, until yours remembers how. The words, so sincere and without pretense, broke something open inside Nora, a door she had thought permanently sealed. She didn't pull away from his touch. I can't promise anything, she warned, even as her fingers curled around his. I'm not asking for promises, Vaughn replied. Just a chance. Stay, help with the ranch, see where this goes, or don't. The choice is yours, Nora. The use of her name without the formal miss struck her like a physical touch. She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. And if I ask you to stay? Then I stay, he answered simply. For as long as you want me to. Nora took a deep breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a precipice. Behind her lay the safety of grief, familiar, predictable, isolating. Before her stretched something unknown, frightening in its potential for both joy and pain. I need time, she finally said. This is all unexpected. Vaughn nodded, understanding in his gaze. Time is something I can give. He released her hand gently. I'll need to go to Laramie for the trial anyway. That should give you space to think. Relief mingled with an unexpected disappointment at the loss of his touch. Thank you, she said quietly. As they stood together watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, Nora realized that for the first time in a year, she was thinking about tomorrow with something other than dread. The weeks that followed brought gradual changes to the Z-Bar Ranch. True to his word, Vaughn traveled to Laramie for Blackwood's preliminary hearing, where enough evidence was presented to ensure the outlaw would stand trial for his numerous crimes. Nora gave her own testimony, facing her husband's killer with a strength that surprised even herself. During Vaughn's absence, Nora found herself missing his steady presence more than she had anticipated. The ranch seemed oddly quiet without him, despite the daily bustle of activity. She used the time to think, to sort through the complicated feelings that had begun to emerge from beneath her grief. When Vaughn returned after 10 days away, Nora was waiting on the porch, a sight that brought a smile to his weary face. Welcome back, she greeted him, suddenly shy despite having rehearsed this moment in her mind. Good to be back, he replied, dismounting with the fluid grace she had come to appreciate. The ranch looks well. We've been busy, she acknowledged. Fixed the roof on the barn, started building a new bunkhouse. She hesitated, then added, I've been thinking about what you said. About staying. Vaughn's expression remained carefully neutral, though his eyes betrayed his interest. And I'd like you to, Nora said simply. Stay, that is. Help me rebuild this place. See where things lead. The smile that spread across Vaughn's face was like sunrise after a long night. I'd like that too, he said. That evening, they walked together along the creek that marked the western boundary of the ranch. The late summer air was warm, filled with the scent of sage and pine from the distant mountains. I've been thinking about James's dream, Nora said as they paused on the bank. About breeding horses instead of just running cattle. It's a good dream, Vaughn replied. This land would be perfect for it. I think I'd like to try, she continued. Not immediately, we need to get the ranch back on solid footing first. But eventually. We? Vaughn questioned gently. Nora met his gaze steadily. Yes, we. If you're still interested in being part of this place. In answer, Vaughn took her hand, his touch warm and sure. I'm interested in being part of whatever you'll allow me to be part of, Nora Ziegler. The simple statement, devoid of pressure or expectation, cemented her decision. This man understood loss, understood healing, understood that the heart sometimes needed to find its own pace. I can't promise it will be easy, she warned. I still have days where grief hits me like it's brand new. I know, Vaughn assured her. I have those days too. But maybe we can help each other through them. As they walked back toward the ranch house, hand in hand under the vast Wyoming sky, Nora felt the first true stirrings of hope take root in her heart. Not a replacement for what she had lost, but something new and unexpected, a second chance she hadn't believed possible. Fall gave way to winter, and the Z-Bar Ranch settled into a rhythm that incorporated Vaughn's presence as naturally as if he had always been there. He proved himself not only capable, but innovative, suggesting improvements to the operation that Nora might never have considered. Together, they weathered the first heavy snows, the cattle drives to winter pasture, and the 1,000 daily challenges of ranch life. They also weathered the moments when grief would unexpectedly resurface, a remembered anniversary, a found possession, a dream that left either of them reaching for ghosts in the night. Christmas came, bringing with it Porter and Reed for a brief visit, along with Noah's widow Eliza and young Nathan, now nearly 3 years old. The house filled with warmth and laughter for the first time since James's death. Watching Vaughn with his nephew, the gentle way he answered endless questions and told stories of the boy's father, Nora, felt something shift inside her. This man, who had come to her ranch seeking vengeance, had instead found a way forward that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. After the guests had gone and the house was quiet once more, Nora found Vaughn on the porch, despite the bitter cold. She joined him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Your family is lovely," she said, standing close enough that their arms touched. "Nathan has your eyes. And Noah's curiosity," Vaughn replied with a fond smile. "Everything is why with that boy." "You're good with him," Nora observed. "Have you ever thought of having children of your own?" The question surprised them both. Vaughn turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "I have," he admitted, "more recently than I would have expected." The implication hung in the cold air between them. They had grown closer over the past months, finding comfort in each other's company, sharing occasional touches and meaningful glances. But neither had taken the step that would transform their partnership into something more intimate. "Vaughn," Nora began, her heart suddenly racing, "I need to ask you something." "Anything," he replied, his voice steady despite the tension she could feel in him. "Are you patient enough to wait for a woman who's still learning how to love again? Who isn't sure if she remembers how?" Vaughn turned fully toward her, his eyes reflecting the moonlight on snow. "Nora, I'd wait a lifetime if that's what you needed." She took a deep breath, summoning courage she wasn't sure she possessed. "What if I don't want to wait that long?" Understanding dawned in his eyes. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, he raised a hand to her cheek. His touch was warm despite the cold night air. "Then we take it one day at a time," he murmured, "together." When his lips met hers, Nora felt something bloom in her chest, not the passionate fire of youth, but something deeper, steadier. A warmth that promised to endure through winter storms and summer droughts, through good years and bad, through all the seasons of a life built together. As they drew apart, Vaughn rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Nora Ziegler," he whispered, "not instead of who I've lost, but because of who you are." The words simple, honest, perfect broke the final barrier around her heart. "And I love you, Vaughn Hayes," she replied, the admission bringing not pain as she had feared, but a profound sense of rightness. "Enough to build a future with you, if you'll have me." "Is that a proposal, Miss Ziegler?" he asked, a smile playing at his lips. "I believe it is, Mr. Hayes," she confirmed, smiling back through tears that, for once, were born of joy rather than sorrow. Spring came early that year, bringing with it new life across the ranch. Calves wobbled on spindly legs beside their mothers, wildflowers carpeted the meadows, and the creek ran high with snowmelt from the mountains. On a perfect April morning, with the Medicine Bow Peak standing sentinel in the distance, Nora Ziegler became Nora Hayes in a simple ceremony on the ranch she and James had built, and that she and Vaughn would continue to build together. The guests were few but cherished Porter and Reed, Eliza and little Nathan, Patrick and his wife from town, Tanner and the ranch hands who had become like family. Even the sheriff attended, bringing news that Silas Blackwood had been sentenced to hang for his crimes. Justice doesn't bring them back, the sheriff said quietly to the newly married couple. But it lets their spirits rest easier, I think. And lets the living move forward, Vaughn added, his arm around Nora's waist. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Nora and Vaughn stood together on the hill where James was buried. She had insisted on coming here, needing this moment of acknowledgement and farewell. "I'll always love him," she said softly, looking at the simple wooden cross that marked her first husband's resting place. "Part of my heart will always be his." "As it should be," Vaughn replied, his hand steady in hers. "Just as part of mine will always belong to Noah." Nora turned to face him, this man who had taught her that a heart, even one shattered by grief, could learn to love again. "But the rest of it," she said, placing her free hand over his heart, feeling its strong, steady beat beneath her palm. "The rest of it is yours, Vaughn Hayes, for as long as we both shall live." "And beyond," he promised, covering her hand with his own. As they walked back toward the ranch house, their home, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Ahead lay a future neither of them could have imagined 2 years earlier, a future built not on the ashes of what they had lost, but on the foundation of what they had found in each other. Nora's heart, once too shattered to heal, now beat in time with Vaughn's two rhythms that had found their harmony in the vast, unforgiving, beautiful wilderness of Wyoming. Together, they would face whatever came next, strong in the knowledge that love, true love, could survive even the deepest wounds. And in the years that followed, as the Z-Bar Ranch prospered and grew, as children's laughter once again filled the house James had built, as the dream of a horse breeding operation became reality, Nora would sometimes pause in her daily tasks to watch Vaughn working in the distance. In those moments, she would place a hand over her heart and feel its strong, steady beat, a heart that had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting, but rather finding the courage to love again. For Vaughn had kept his promise. When her heart had forgotten how to beat on its own, his had beaten for them both. And now they beat together, creating a rhythm as enduring as the mountains that watched over their home, as constant as the stars that guided them, as eternal as the love they had found in each other's wounded, healing hearts.